And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Copeland with the North Carolina Council of Churches, and I am pleased to welcome as our guest today, Poet Laureate Jaki Shelton Green. Mainly, I'm pleased to welcome her because I'm an English major, and selfishly, I love the way that she puts words together to make a world. But professionally, I'm glad to welcome her to help us carry on the great tradition of the Council of Churches, which was founded 85 years ago this year for one primary reason: to right the wrongs of racial inequality. And now, 85 years later, I greet you on behalf of 18 denominations that have united with us in this most important work, recognizing the church's complicity in racial injustice, by some churches outright support for slavery, by others only benign neglect in the face of injustice. It was our founder, Shelton Smith, who thought it crucial that this be an ecumenical effort to right the wrongs. And in these 85 years, the Council has often acted courageously in the face of hostility, always spoken prophetically in the face of injustice. We seek to do nothing less today, as we are inspired and challenged by Jaki Shelton Green. And now let me introduce to you our host for today's event, Council of Churches Governing Board member Paul McAllister. Thank you, Paul, and welcome, Jaki.
Thank you, Jennifer, and it's so good to be with all of our guests and also Jaki Shelton Smith today. And we're also related to have, or I should say happy, that we will also have at some point in our conversation, Reverend Greg Drumwright. Let me introduce our guest speaker for this event. Jaki Shelton Green, 9th Poet Laureate of North Carolina, is the first African American and third woman to be appointed as the North Carolina Poet Laureate. She is a 2019 Academy of American Poet Laureate Fellow, 2014 North Carolina a Hall of Fame inductee, 2009 North Carolina Piedmont Laureate appointment, 2003 recipient of the North Carolina Award for Literature. Jaki also teaches documentary poetry at Duke University Center for Documentary Studies and has been named the 2021 Frank B. Haynes Writer in Residence at UNC Chapel Hill. Her publications are many, and they include Dead on Arrival, Masks, Dead on Arrival and New Poems, Conjure Blues, Singing a Tree into Dance, Breath of the Song, Feeding the Light, and I Want to Undie You. On Juneteenth, 2020, she released her first LP poetry album, The River Speaks of Thirst, produced by Soul City Sounds and Clearly Records. Jaki is the owner of Sister Write, providing writing retreats for women writers in Sedona, Arizona, Martha's Vineyard, Ocracoke, North Carolina, Northern Morocco, and Tullamore, Ireland. And there are many, many other things that we could say about Jaki Shelton Green. We're so proud that she could be with us today. And as we listen and learn and appreciate the gift that God has given to her, we pray that we would also learn and understand, and then we will enter into an engaging conversation with her and also Reverend Drumwright, who we will introduce at the appropriate time.
I'm so sorry. There are notices flashing on my screen. Hello, everyone, and much gratitude to Jennifer and to Paul for this invitation. I'm going to leap right into my comments, my commentary, because I truly do not like being the talking head. What's very important today is that we have an engaged discourse, and I look forward to that. James Baldwin was arrested on December 19, 1949 in Paris as a receiver of stolen goods. He spent 8 days in prison. The reason for this? A new American acquaintance showed up at his apartment and gave him a sheet that Baldwin did not know he had taken from another hotel room. Baldwin was arrested. Those 8 days were the reality that he had not escaped torturous racism and hatred, which he thought he had fled in the United States. On the day of his release, after charges were dropped on December 27th, the full story behind the incident was told in the courtroom, which elicited a great fervor of laughter and excitement and merriment. James Baldwin was chilled by the merriment and this laughter, even though perhaps that laughter was meant to warm him. In his own words in this story, Equal in Paris, an autobiographical story, James Baldwin states, "This laughter is the laughter of those who consider themselves to be at a safe removal from all the wretched, for whom the pain of the living is not real." I had heard it so often in my native land that I had resolved to be in a place, to find a place where I would never hear it anymore. In some deep, Black, strong, and liberating way, my life in my own eyes, says Baldwin, began during that first year in Paris, when it was born in me that this laughter is universal and never can be stilled. When James Baldwin returned to the Grand Hotel du Bac, he was told that he needed to pay his very exorbitant hotel bill within the hour where he had to leave the premises. Despairingly, James Baldwin took one of the dirty bed sheets that had actually been the cause of the entire incident and used it to try to hang himself from a water pipe in the room. The pipe gave way, spraying the room and Baldwin with water. At this, Baldwin began to laugh hysterically. He gathered his belongings and he left the hotel, never to return to it again. This text, this brief text, brings me to this discussion about celebrating Christmas. This text by James Baldwin, a text in a time of fear, Christmas in a time of fear. It offers us a framework that we might start to think about. It starts with acknowledgement, compassionate living, compassionate listening, and building new strategic frameworks for change. The question today, December 18, 2020, is how do we laugh? How do we celebrate Christmas when hope feels impossible? At the end of a year filled with fear and increasing violence, it can seem difficult for many of us to look forward to 2021, especially with any kind of enthusiasm. On top of that, we think of the COVID virus. For many among marginalized groups in the United States, this year has been a brutal reminder of how deeply rooted our fellow citizens feel about empathy. No empathy for us. Many of us are justifiably concerned for our own basic safety and well-being, which are anything but secure. And yet in this moment, we see Christmas trees filling the streets, holiday standards serenade us everywhere, standing in lines in the grocery store, the pharmacy. Nativity scenes show up outside our churches, our faith-based places. For some, it might be a welcome reprieve. The colors, the sounds, the smells of this season. They convey a joy that doesn't seem to be earned by the state of our world or this country. My question, is it a betrayal to celebrate? Does it mean that we have to put out of our minds all the images of bloodied bodies, sobbing refugees, crammed detention centers, grieving family members of men and women killed by police? Does it mean we have to forget our fears for the future and pretend we have comfort and joy, when in fact, many of us have none? If Christmas is only an escape from our hurt and horror at the state of the world, we cannot afford it. Nowhere has this message been delivered more urgently and more poignantly than by the organizers of the 1963 Christmas boycott, a Christmas boycott that called on families to refrain from buying gifts that year as a response to the white supremacist bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, in September of that year. In that attack, 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley had been killed. On the same day, 2 young Black boys, Virgil Wade and Johnny Robinson, were also shot and killed in Birmingham. The original organizers of this boycott included James Baldwin, the actors Ossie and Ruby Dee, and the journalist Louis Lomax. These people saw the deaths of the tender 6 in Birmingham to be a reflection of the negligence of the American people. In 1963, the Illustrated News talked about their case. Thousands of atrocities committed against humanity and the Negro people from slavery to the present time have gone unpunished. And now we are mocking the Prince of Peace, throwing bombs in the holy place of God, blasting the brains of his children against the high walls of his tabernacle in Birmingham, turning his day of days into a Sabbath ritual of blood and destruction. We are guilty. Not only those who planted the bomb, but those who condone justice and segregation and thereby give it sanction, those who profit from it, and those who do not work to eradicate it. That was the statement of Baldwin. Rather than giving gifts, the organizers urged families to give to the organizations and institutions working to build and strengthen the moral and religious fiber of our nation, the civil rights movement instead. Baldwin had actually advocated for this boycott as early as the week after the bombing. In an interview, he said, "I think that one should tell one's children," he insisted, "that there will be no Santa Claus this year because your brothers and your sisters, I mean this no matter what color you are, your co-citizens were murdered in Sunday school." As the group wrote, children should be told Santa will not come this year because he is mourning for the deaths of the children in Birmingham, and there will be no gifts this year or the next year. The boycott was a recognition that racism is a dire threat to the heart of Christianity. At 16th Street Baptist Church, the bombing had shattered the face of Christ in a stained glass window of the Good Shepherd, while the rest of the window remained intact. Commenting on this, Baldwin noted that alabaster face that had been destroyed in the attack, the white face of a white Christ, represented the religion that had victimized his people for so long. If Christ has no face, Baldwin suggested, then perhaps it is a time that we give him a new face and make the whole ideal, the whole hope of Christian love, a reality. The comfort of joy of Christmas should not come from setting aside our mourning, our pain, and our outrage, but by recognizing it. It is to the mournful, pained, and outraged world that God sends great tidings of goodwill and peace. This was part of the message of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1967 Ebenezer sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church in order to explain the Christmas proclamation of peace, Luke 2:14. He did not turn, as one might expect, to the full text from the Gospel of Luke describing Jesus' birth, but instead, Dr. King reminded his hearers and those who witnessed of Jesus' suffering and his unconquerable love. There is a great speech you should research by King, and I'm not going to give excerpts from it, but it's worthy, its context is worthy of research. Martin Luther King says, "We experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before, and his uncertainty disappeared, and he was ready to face anything." The joy of Christmas, even in its least religiously explicit expressions of lights and colors and spices and warmth, has its most fundamental meaning in this realization: the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. From John 1st and 5th. How do we celebrate Christmas when hope feels impossible? But then that is what Christmas really is. Honoring the birth of Christ cannot mean escaping from the inconvenient reminders of the world's violence and cruelty, but rather, as Dr. King did that night, it is an opportunity to lay bare our despair, our horror, our fear, believing that broken hearts are exactly where God takes flesh. We must open ourselves to joy that we cannot summon on our own. This means right now, in December 2020, more than ever, giving concrete expression to our belief in a cosmic companionship by supporting movements that work against injustice or racism in any form. But it also means allowing ourselves to hear the words of the carols we sing, a thrill of joy. The weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. And how do we allow ourselves to see the brightness of lights on a tree that know how to survive the winter? How will we survive this time? Hope is not an illusion. It is what reveals the truth about who we really are. We were not made for murder and brutality. We were not made to lie. We were not made for the reckless, consuming, astonishing, and excessive love we see both in the manger and on the cross. This year, like so many years, truth has been crushed. But I believe as we gather in these spaces, just like this morning and every morning, that a truth crushed earth is on its way to rising again. It is on its way, and we are here as the bearers of that light, as the bearers of that truth. So I thank you all this morning for leaning into thinking about how do we laugh in this time of sorrow, in this time of light. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaki. And we're going to begin to take questions. You may enter your questions into the chat. Also, we have an administrator who will be fielding questions on Facebook, and those will be provided to us. And so I'm going to begin by asking you, as you think about Christmas and the many Christmases that you have experienced, what gives you hope in this particular season with all that is happening in the world and all that has transpired in recent days? How are you inspired by the things that you see going on around you?
I am inspired by the engagement of young people. I am inspired by the intergenerational linking of hands and hearts. I'm inspired because I think we are finally understanding what it means to be compassionate listeners, not just active listeners. We can be active listeners all day long and never be compassionate listeners. So I am given hope when I see Black, brown, and red and white people together, walking and praying and crying and going to prison, and sometimes even being harmed together. I don't celebrate that harm, but I celebrate that we may feel alone often in this struggle, but we are a mighty force when we are linked. And that's what I have to hold on to. As a woman of 67 years old who has participated in many marches and many demonstrations, from the civil rights movement to the Vietnam War, to the occupation of Cambodia, to many, many other things that I have walked for, and Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s and been imprisoned for. I know that our spirit is greater than any sword, and that's what inspires me.
I'm thinking of a passage in the Bible that says, hope does not make us ashamed. And you talked a lot about hope because of the love of God, which is expressed within our hearts. And so I guess the question that I often think about is, how should we connect hope to love? And also, how should we connect love to hope? What is the relationship in your mind as a poet between those two abstract things that are so often mixed and confused and muddled? How should we look at hope in relation to love?
You know, as believers, and people can define that however they want to, but as believers, you know, a lot of us use the captions of being a righteous, loving people, God-fearing people, and yet we do not speak out against oppression. There is no hope if everyone is oppressed, and not just physically oppressed, but the imprisonment, the bondage of the Holy Spirit, of the Spirit, when people allow themselves to be bound up, uh, because people don't often understand the context of what hope means. You know, we're more afraid. You know, for me, love is how I show that to my next door neighbor, you know, whether they show it back or not. And I have that situation where I live next door to a very right wing, unfortunately, very young person uh, who is victimized, is bound hostage by who he is as a Southern white young male, uneducated, uh, whose only literacy of compassion is for people who look like himself. He's kind and generous and sweet. He cuts our grass. He's a lovely neighbor. But he does not understand the depth of what it means to be a human being. You know, the ideal of some of us have learned how to practice being very politically polite. It is not a time for political politeness. If we're talking about real hope and going forth and eradicating some of these things, then we have to first, as many of my brothers and sisters are doing, Black and white, we have to first get it right with ourselves. We have to first do our life work. We've got to figure out why we think the way we think about some things. What are the values and misled notions around history are we still holding on to? And we've made them be the truth, because actually people of clergy stand in high places, and many of us are not talking about hope. We're talking about oppression. We're talking about oppression. We're talking about leading us back into a legacy, you know, of division. So those of us who are on this other side, who are trying so hard to stay in the light, I think it begins with self-introspection. And I think it begins with our organizations who are willing to do the work, to dismantle, you know, our mission statements, to dismantle how we operate daily, to take a real look at ourselves. Those pretty white bandages that we keep putting on the problem, guess what? The stink still rises to the top. And we spend a lifetime putting on pretty little white bandages. But the wound is still there. We have to clean the wound. And cleaning the wound hurts. It hurts. But guess what? It heals. And when it heals, there is no more nasty oozing to the top. So hope for me comes in knowing that some of us are willing to go through that transformation of pain so that we can enjoy what joy looks like. It's supposed to look like for children of God.
You remind me of the words that I used to hear my childhood pastor say many, many years ago, Jaki. His name was Owens Powell. And he used to say to his congregation, sometimes I may have to hurt you to heal you. And so as I think about the relationship between love and hope, healing becomes, for me, the nexus between those two. And you bring that out in such a beautiful way that I've really never thought about before. Healing is part of what's necessary, or is the means whereby we are able to connect love to hope. But, as we think about what is happening in the lives of so many persons, and you talked about children give you hope. There are many children today who are wondering where their fathers and their mothers are. There are many children who this country, as blessed as it is, has abandoned at the border, or allowed their family members to be taken from their lives and stripped away from them as if they don't matter. What should give those children hope? And how should we be responsive to their need in the instances where we can see there is dire need and desperation, and even, yes, hopelessness?
Yeah, that's a hard one. It's a hard one and it's not a hard one because we have to look at why we have allowed this moment in time to even happen. When I'm in other countries, I have a lot of conversations with, cab drivers and people working in hotels, or the people who take care of me at my house in Morocco. And they're always saying, we don't understand your people. Why are your people not in the streets? There would be no work. There would be no economy because we all would be in the streets. And we've seen this across the world. Some of the things that have happened in this country, other countries have shut down over. There would be no children in cages. So how have we even allowed this to happen? And I don't know if the children even know that we are out here talking about it, that we are out here lobbying so hard against it when they are there alone. What do they know about hope? How do they spell hope? How does it wrap them up at night in the cold? How does it appear in a bowl of cold food with bugs in it? There's no hope in there. They don't see that hope. But we still have to keep pushing. We have to do the work. And the children have almost been forgotten. We ain't talking about the children no more. It's on to the next person that got murdered. Then we'll be talking about the next one. Then we'll be talking about the next one. So when I look at us's, yeah, it is a clarion call. Someone just wrote it in the chat. It's a clarion call. Why aren't we? And when I say in the streets, I don't mean, my brother in Alamance County, Reverend Drumright, being able to mobilize, constituents across the state to come, but I'm meaning billions of Americans. When wealthy white men of corporate America are at the head of these marches, corporate white American men, when they are at the head of any march on decency and humanity and a call that says enough evil is enough, and it is evil. Let's call it what it is. It is evil to put babies in cages. It was evil in 1963 to tear gas and to pepper spray people, and it is evil today in 2020. It is evil for us to collectively watch on live TV in broad open daylight the murder of a human being. Actual live, upfront and personal, looking in the murderer's face. This is who we are. This is who we have become. And we cannot be these Merlot drinking, living in the suburb revolutionaries. What is the cost of it? What are we willing to sacrifice? What are we really willing to sacrifice? And I know that as the poet laureate, as a truth teller, there are many, many times that I'm thinking, oh, the governor's going to get that call because I just probably stepped out of a comfort zone. I'm supposed to be talking about engagement of the literary arts. I cannot talk about the engagement of the literary arts if all the people who would be served by the engagement of literary arts are oppressed. And that's my truth. So what are we willing to do for these children, for our grandchildren, for the children unborn? What are we willing to do for ancestors who are looking at us saying, you are my greatest dream, but don't screw it up. Like, get it right. I endured that middle passage for a reason. That's what they're saying. I did not jump off the boat in the middle of the Atlantic. My bones are not at the bottom of the middle of the Atlantic. You are here because I stayed on the boat, because I endured the middle passage. So this is our middle passage. What are we willing to endure? And that's my question for all of us. And I don't have the answers, but my heart is open to engage collectively with all of our brokenness, trying to figure it out. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that holds some space for the question that you ask.
Oh, it absolutely does. And we do have a question that has come in, but before I read it, I want to say to those who are listening that as Jaki asks us the question, what are we willing to sacrifice? What immediately comes to mind is a scripture that we quote all the time, those of us who are church going, for God so loved that he gave. And so it should be not necessarily easy, but it should be, as someone said earlier, and you mentioned also, Jaki, a clarion call to a life of sacrifice, a life of endurance, a life of appreciating our ancestry and those who paved and paid a price, who paved the road and paid the price for us to have many of the opportunities and luxuries that we have in such grand style and opulence today. So let's get to this question that we have from, I believe it is Lynn or Lino, I'm not sure, but it says, what are poetry and faith, if not speaking truth and illuminating what we must all sacrifice to ensure love and justice? That's a very good question. And I also want to bring in Reverend Drumright to answer that question as well. Let me tell you something about him. Reverend Gregory B. Drumright is an organizer, and he'll tell you more about what he does and how long he's been doing it. He is also a professor of communications at High Point University, a senior principal consultant with Leadership Enhancement and Academic Development, or LEAD. He is also a commissioner, or was a commissioner, from 2018 to 2020 with the North Carolina General Legislative Assembly Courts Commission, and founder and senior minister and national recording artist with the Citadel Church and Campus Ministries that was founded in 2003. So back to the question, and this is for both Greg and also Jaki, what are poetry and faith, if not speaking truth and illuminating what we must all sacrifice to ensure love and justice?
Well, I don't think it's a question. I think that it's a very emphatic statement. Very emphatic. For me, poetry is my faith. It's my ministry. It's my calling. You know, we all have voices, and how we use our voices really should matter. You know, when we are blessed with certain things and we do not enhance them, we do not develop them, we do not nurture ourselves to be our better selves, then we are not being true to our faith. So that's what it means to me. I think the person who wrote the question, it's a very emphatic statement, and she or he is absolutely right. Um, and I'm happy that that person sees poetry as speaking truth. I often get in a lot of trouble as a poet for speaking truth, but for me, my poetry, my craft of being a poet, being a writer, being a voice, is the everydayness and ordinariness of art. So for me, it's teaching young people that art is not always in a museum. We are all human museums, and our poetry and our truths are embedded in us. And we only have to open ourselves up and invite others into our human museums. Everybody on the screen is a human museum. So I thank the person who put that in the chat to validate this truth that the art, not just poetry, but all of the arts have this just incredible power to be of service for all activism and advocacy.
And the person's name is indeed Lynn. My lenses perhaps are not as clear as they need to be. Reverend Drumright, why don't you answer this question for us as well? Thank you, Jaki, for giving a response to that.
Thank you.
Isaiah 1:17 says, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. One of the many scriptures from our sacred text that lead us to this understanding. If you believe in Jesus, you believe in justice. But I have traveled far enough and wide enough, just a little bit, to know that if you believe in Muhammad, you believe in justice. I have spent time in Israel to learn that if you are Jew, you believe in justice. And I have spent enough time with agnostics and people who don't believe in any higher power to appreciate this one thing, that they believe in goodwill, and if so, they believe in justice. And so my answer to that question really takes me back to an email that I received earlier this week, as I have tempered my pastor preacher self in the midst of this movement, knowing that I have been marching with people who are not believers, that I've been marching with people who are from other faiths. Largely what we're doing is quite intersectional. And therefore, I have held back my divinity self, my ecumenical self, to just build community. But out of so many messages that I receive from folks, I received one today from a brother from another mother's, like I like to say it, who said, you know, I've been marching with you, and it has led me to start praying and reading the sacred text again. And I find myself tuning in to your Sunday worship services. I never advertise those services in doing this justice work because I want to build the beloved community and not necessarily the Citadel Church. But I was so encouraged because in doing this work, people are sensing, even with just a little bit of my preacher self that slips out here and there, people are being led back to the hope that they let go of. I believe in the absence of hope, what do we have? People are asking me in all these interviews and conversations, what do you see coming for Alamance County? And I always find myself inwardly being choked because with my naked eyes, it doesn't seem like that monument is coming down anytime soon. There's more than 24 monuments that have been unerected, but that one still remains. With my naked eyes, I see the police still targeting peaceful protesters. I see that people who are showing up just to have public comments at a community meeting being drugged out of commissioners' meetings just because they're there to speak out and not out of turn, by the way. With my naked eyes, every time I step into Alamance County with the beloved community, we're being met with militia force. But on the inside, I feel hopeful. On the inside, even if it's just 1 or 2 emails a week from folks saying something is changing, I feel hopeful. And I am grateful for the witness that we have in this masterful poet, my elder sister that is sharing a little bit of her time with me today to just give comments. Thank you. I'm encouraged by the things that you have said. It reminds me of my appreciation for Baldwin's work. As I have been fighting Black insanity is what I call it in the midst of this George Floyd summer and Freedom Fall, and now we're going into winter, still marching, still pleading, still advocating. Baldwin said to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all of the time. And a lot of people have taken that righteous rage and turned it into angry Black men and angry Black women. And what our sister Shelton has said today is that it's time for us to just put to the side political politeness. And finally, and today is my birthday. I turned 41 today. I'm really just a junior, just a son in this work. But finally, we have reached the point and the pocket in society where it's okay for sisters like Shelton and my sister from Wake Forest, Sarah, and brothers like Paul to be angry. And Sarah, I know you're not African-American, but I just want to include you in that. But it's okay to be angry. And now folks are willing to hear from angry Black women. This is the moment of the African-American woman. Finally, it's okay for the boardroom to embrace not just a conforming brother, but an angry Black brother that's not there with any physical weapons. But we all know this scripture, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God. And so I am asking the Lord for daily strength in this movement because we have so much work to do. But in the absence of hope, what do we have? And that's why I'm still doing it.
That's right.
So we have many questions, but I want to quote a scripture and get your response to this in addition to some of the upcoming questions. What does love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you? What does that mean in the context of Christmas, in a time of fear, in a time of rage, in a time of consciousness, in a time of anger? How do you love your enemy? And how does your enemy know that you are blessing them when you resist oppression, that you're liberating them when you stand against all that stands against hope? How do you respond to that?
Are you asking me?
Sure. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Well, Paul, this is going to sound probably a little flip, but it's not about Christmas for me. It's how we show up in our daily lives. It's how we live our lives. And to be very frank and honest with you, I have not chosen that my work be any worriment for the person you just talked about, because the struggle I'm in also takes care of them. It's not just for me. Like I keep reminding people, Black folk don't have a problem in America. America has a problem. America has a race problem. Black folk have been Black forever, and we're going to die Black. But as James Baldwin said many, many years ago, America is not in love with itself. And that's why America continually has to find someone to oppress, to beat up, because it's so in love with itself. And when America can fall in love with itself, it might not need anybody to oppress. So when I do the work, you know, a lot of my white brothers and sisters say, how do I talk to my cousin? How do I talk to my brother? How do I talk to this relative who is so on the other side of everything that I believe in and stand up for? And I'm like, you respect them, you love them, but you do your work. You do you. You live your life, you fight the fights, because the fight you fight for justice is a fight for all human and natural life. It's not just for Black folk, it's for all of us. See, when people forget, we are an American people. Black folk in America, we are an American people. So this is not Black history. This is not a moment in Black folks' lives. It is a moment in all of our lives. You know, so this is where I get very, very frustrated with people who talk about hope and fly this flag of hope. You know, it just becomes this kind of elusive thing to hope for. But it's how our everydayness, how we show up in making hope. You know, I see hope happening when COVID first started. Here in my little tiny, small town that I live in, that has a lot of racism. I mean, visible signs of racism. Men, you know, brothers with Confederate stuff all over their body and language on their body parts that suggest hatred. I stay out of their way. I do me. You know, but they are there. But what I saw during this moment in COVID, where there was a kindness, there was a generosity, there was a gentleness in public spaces that was not normally there. For like inside of this tiny moment, some people realize we are all in this together. Now, there are people who believe that COVID only affects Black folk. That's why I don't have to wear a mask. And these are exact words. These are exact words from white men. I'm not Black. I ain't gotta wear no mask. It ain't gonna bother me. So the question becomes, well, even though that's not true, but even if you believe that, what about you interacting with me? And you know what the response was? That would not be my problem. So there is that. But inside, we all have our daily moments where we actually can touch hope. We see it when we see children playing on a playground and they have no questions whatsoever about whether they should come near each other and share a toy or a swing. In the beginning of COVID, I experienced this over and over again, watching acts of generosity, of strangers helping other people across all kinds of boundaries, boundaries of age, gender, race. So these possibilities are real. But I have always believed that I cannot change what is happening in Minnesota. I cannot change what's happening, across the ocean. But if I keep digging where I live, like my brother is doing in Alamance County, if I keep scratching and scratching a little bit every day, I effect change. So a lot of my white brothers and sisters call me, what do I do? Oh my God, I don't know what to do. And they're freaking out. And I'm like, well, what have you been doing? Who's your tribe? Who are your people? Who do you hold and who holds you? Hold them closer. There's a time when you don't go out, you pull closer in. And it's that time that we tighten up the circles. And we have to be real clear about who is in the circle. And are they there for the right reasons? And are they going to be with me through the end? And how deep can we scratch together in, you know what I mean, in our tiny little spaces? We are powerful. We are more powerful than we realize we are. We have the medicine. The medicine is inside of us. The medicine is our faith. The medicine is our unconditional love. The medicine is, somebody wrote, good trouble. It's the medicine that our children need to see. Our children need to see that we fought for a future for them. That's what they need to witness. That we believe them with the same tenacity that our ancestors, when we become the ancestors, that they can say, my ancestors fought hard the way my ancestors' ancestors fought. So we have to show them that. And I think everybody on the screen knows how to do that. It's not a lost art. Compassion, tenderness, friendliness, respect. It's not a lost art.
So we have a question from Joyce Dallas, and I want to direct this question first to Greg, and then we'll come back to you, Jaki. And the question is, every year that we celebrate, there is suffering happening somewhere, but perhaps not to us. So this year, it is not so much more egregious as more personal. How do we learn to personalize it all and fight it and still celebrate? And Greg, I think that's a great question for you because you're such a masterful coalition builder, not just here in Alamance County, but as I understand it, in various places around the country, including Georgia and Louisville and across intergenerational, I should say, generational lines and gender lines and racial lines, even in Minnesota. So how do we fight and still celebrate, Greg?
Wow. I have found myself realizing that I can only do what the Lord has anointed and strengthened Greg to do as I receive messages from people who are asking me, why aren't you fighting against the crime that's happening in your community? Why aren't you fighting against the gun violence? Why don't you leave us alone in Alamance County and go back to Greensboro and deal with the rising murder rates here? I realized that all of us are fearfully and wonderfully made, and therefore God has given each of us a specific purpose. And while every time I receive a notification of young folks dying here in Greensboro, and I want to run to the matter, I realize that my work, and at the end of our life, we'll call it my lot, is to do exactly what the Lord is commanding and the Holy Spirit is speaking me to do. And that's actually my joy. It's not in any commendation. It's not in any award. It's not in any recognition. It's not in all the press. My celebration is to know that we're moving the needle forward, even if just a little bit, in fulfilling the purpose of bringing to bear all of the stories and the horrors and the laments and the injustices that is happening through our criminal justice system, through lawless police, through racism and bigotry and bias. And that's what I celebrate, just that little piece of the work getting done, while I know that there is so much work that needs to continue to go on all around us.
We want to ask this last question in the 2 or 3 minutes, I think, that we have left. And I must say, the thing about you, Greg, that is so astounding to so many, and since I've met you, I see a gracious humility that adorns the work that you do. And I would say that's one of the ways that we can see how those who are freedom fighters and justice warriors are able to celebrate in a time of fear, is by maintaining an attitude of servanthood and humility that, as you've said, does not depend upon the accolades of people, but the acknowledgement of the Spirit, because only God can exalt a person, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled and abased, but those who humble themselves will be exalted and will abound. Let's take another question, and we only have about 2 minutes left, but I think both of you may be able to answer this question fairly quickly. And this comes from one of the staff at the North Carolina Council of Churches, which is sponsoring this event, Michelle Peden. How can we invite loved ones to move through guilt, paralysis, hopelessness to action, compassion for others and themselves, and hope?
Well, I think we demonstrate by how we ourselves move through guilt, paralysis, hopelessness to action, compassion for others, and hope. I think that we become the model. Sometimes we have to get out of our own ways and think that we actually can bring people to the table, or we actually can save folk. But for me, it's all about how we live these embodiments of action. You know, I want to go back to that other question because I think it ties to this. Joy is a very powerful collective resistance tool. Joy should be our revolution. Collective joy, inside of every movement, every revolution, there has been music. Out of the civil rights movement, we have revolution, we have movement music. Out of the Black Panther and the Black love movement, we have so much poetry, we have so much dance, we have so much that has come out as the arts. But for me, it's very simple, and maybe too simple for the answer, but it's how people see us do it without always talking about it. I'm always more impressed with what I be than what I say I'm going to be, or what I say I'm going to do. What am I doing? And what is the measurement? And how can people actually see the built-in renewabilities? When Those of us who are activists, when Greg is somewhere training or teaching or working with people, it's about how we multiply ourselves times 2,000. Because if we're taken out by a Mack truck driving back down 40 coming from somewhere, and we have not actually helped people step inside of what it means to be an activist, then we have failed. So it's how many leadership is about how many people we groom, how many people that we clone, not thinking that we are the ones, but how can we clone leadership? Leadership is not holding it to ourselves, but how do we allow people to see themselves inside of us? And that's what community building is about. When we're sharing our stories, when we're sitting in spaces, first of all of us should, that last question I wanted to answer, because it's like, I don't know how to tell you to feel sorrow. You should be feeling sorrow right now. I mean, I don't know. That's a hard one for me, because I cannot see any child hungry across the street and it not be me, it not be us. So how do we see ourselves inside of these moments of people who are in despair? How do we see ourselves inside of it? And to me, sometimes I have to get out of my way. I have to get out of the training. I have to get out of the paradigms that I've been taught. And I think Greg said this very eloquently a few minutes ago, is you allow yourself to be used. You allow yourself to be the service. So I think that we just have to be what we want other people to be. We have to be it. We have to keep doing it. And we really have to stop looking back, talking about who ain't with us. You know what I mean? They will come, or they will start another movement. But it's about strengthening what we have and fortifying what we have. Stop looking back for the beans that are not in the bowl, and enhance the beans that are in the bowl, because they're there. And we need more of that. We need more of this focus. And I know from a clerical standpoint, you want to bring everybody along, but sometimes people have to run and catch up because it's not their time. And we have to also stop judging people. We have to let people be who they need to be in their time. We all were not this conscious. We all did not have this language of what it means to be an activist. We weren't born this way. So we have to give other people their grace time, their follow-up time. We're all stumbling, we're all making it up as we go. And the answer today is not the answer tomorrow. It's already redundant. So that's where I stand in that question, in that insight. And I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Greg, we're going to let you respond to that, and then we're going to close out for the day. Thank you.
I'll be ever so brief. Miss Shelton Green, she's just so eloquent and masterful. So shame on me for even trying to respond after what she shared. I think that we as preachers can appreciate this. The best sermons are the ones that we live, not the ones that we preach. And I honestly believe that in addition to everything that Ms. Shelton Green has said, and even the comments that are trending right now in the chat, lead them. I mean, there is no other way to do it than just for you to do it. Your loved ones. Jaki said, it's time for the CEOs to get out of those boardrooms and out of those office towers and get in the streets. And I've been calling on them. It's time for our chancellors and our university presidents and our bishops who are able enough, and our elders who still can walk in the malls for 2 or 3 miles, to get out in the streets. And I've been asking for that kind of presence. They're saying that it is, you have a greater chance of dying in a car wreck right now than dying in COVID. I wish we could pull some kind of data together to help people to understand you have a greater chance of dying in a plane wreck than dying at a Black Lives Matter peaceful protest today. So there's enough leadership on this line who may be pondering the answer to that question that could appreciate this. First of all, let's just keep doing what we're doing. And in doing so, we will lead the way for our loved ones.
Thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure to meet both you and Jaki and have conversations with you. We want to thank our staff at the North Carolina Council of Churches, certainly our Executive Director, Dr. Jennifer Copeland, for helping us put this event together. We are so appreciative. And as you were wrapping up, Greg, you mentioned getting out in the streets, and it brought my mind to Isaiah chapter 59, verse 14, a passage I know that you know extremely well. So justice is driven back and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets. Honesty cannot enter. You two have helped us today understand what we need to do in order to drive back injustices so that righteousness and truth may prevail. We thank you, we honor you, and we celebrate you as we celebrate Christmas, even in a time of fear. Thank you, audience members, for participating with us. God bless you. And we hope to see you again in a similar forum in 2021. Adios, everybody.